Hello, my name is Jesse Ballenger and I'm the president of the Arizona Archaeological and Historical Society. I'm privileged today to be sitting with Dr. C. Vance Haynes, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology and Geosciences at the University of Arizona. Vance has a 16 millimeter reel that was shot in the year 1967 and 1968, and he allowed us to put that on a DVD and sit down and narrate this with us. Vance, can you tell me a little bit about the tape that we're going to look at today?
Yeah, what I did with that, this is the first time I had ever used a 16 millimeter camera, it's a Bell & Howell. And so I started taking photographs that I thought would eventually show our excavations of the Murray Springs Site in the San Pedro Valley. Yeah, so this is panning across the, I think the Charleston Hills, in the Tombstone Hills in the background. And in the far background are the Mule Mountains, at the south end of which is the the mining district of Bisbee. So we're looking across this yucca grassland to the San Pedro Valley, where the light color ends and the dark color begins. And so this is a shot taken from up near Highway 90, not too far from Benson. Looking to the south over what Kirk Bryan had mapped as the whetstone surface. The whetstone mountains would be off to the right. And we're panning now to the Huachuca Mountains. That's what you're seeing in the backgrounds. Starting over again, you can see in the background there Sierra San Jose. It's an isolated mountain in Mexico that would be an ideal place for a Clovis base camp, because from Sierra San Jose you can see not only up the San Pedro Valley, but you can see south to the upper San Pedro near Cananea. You can see to the east over into the Sulphur Springs Valley. So, and it has water sources. There are springs around Sierra San Jose. And the base of the mountain, the alluvial fan, actually goes right on down to Greenbush Draw, where the Naco Clovis Site is. So it's a very interesting a mountain that needs further exploration. So we're panning here across looking south San Pedro Valley to the Huachuca Mountains now that are coming in. These are some of the highest mountains in southern Arizona. And the little piece of highway that you can see there is Highway 90 going to Sierra Vista and Fort Huachuca. That car now is heading essentially to that area. So I'm taking this actually not too far from where Karshner Caverns is located today. Now we're looking across the yucca grassland now on that surface. And as you mentioned, this isn't too far from where Norm Whalen did his dissertation research on archaeological sites that are in that fan coming off the Whetstone Mountains. So we're closer to the site now, panning along overlooking Curry Draw, where the Murray Springs Clovis Site is.
Here we are. We're on Lewis Hill, Vance. You're up
yeah,
on
this is Lewis Hill, and we could stop here for a minute while we talk about Curry Draw. That's Curry Draw that you see coming into the San Pedro River, and which has this fabulous grove of cottonwoods along it, which are preserved today as part of the San Pedro Riparian Preserve of the Bureau of Land Management. So you can see the San Pedro River flowing with its muddy water.
It's really swollen.
It must have been a recent rain. Yeah, exactly. Because the San Pedro River is one of these rivers that has portions that are absolutely dry in the dry season, and portions that do remain wet all the time, but there's not very many of those left now. But yeah, so you're looking up Curry Draw, and as you can see, it eventually leads to a grassland. Now, part of that grassland that you're seeing in this picture is artificial, because at this point in time, the owner of that property, a man named Cracchiolo, who actually essentially created the town of Sierra Vista. But the government had a program back in those days where they would pay 75% of your expenses if you would take out the desert chaparral, get rid of the Sonoran Desert thorn bush, and plant African love, what's called, I've forgotten the Latin.
Layman's love grass, yeah.
What is it?
Layman's?
Yeah, layman's love grass. It's an African grass. And so he did that to his property by essentially bulldozing it with what's known as a ripper, where the bulldozer actually drags this blade that drops underground, and it just truncates the roots of these plants. And then the dozer itself then just plows it over, so the stuff is turned over. And so that's what you're seeing here. This is not not a normal view of Sonoran vegetation.
And you're talking about the grasslands you can see kind of on the horizon before the Huachuca Mountains.
Yeah, that's the Huachucas in the background.
And then, but we also have grasses on the floodplain close to us with the
yes,
with the cottonwood and the willow. All right, shall I pan?
Yeah, that's the yellow area there. Yeah, so you can start the pan now. So we're panning now across Curry Draw and Mosin Wash. This is Mosin Wash coming in here. And now we're overlooking Bedrock Nose. And I want to point out on this Bedrock Nose that at one time I thought there might be a big lake, because you'll see later the Coral Marl, which is a lake deposit. And we didn't know how big that lake was, but in the event that it might have been a large late Pleistocene lake, I suggested this is a hypothesis, and one of my pieces of evidence was this strand line, which I interpreted as a strand line. Well, it's not a strand line. It's actually an edaphic and geologic effect of a change in bedrock. So with that, it pretty much abandoned the idea of it being a big lake. But there are local ponds, and that's just predating the Clovis stuff. Now stop here. So this is looking down the San Pedro over the buildings you can see there on the left are the Eskapool Ranch, and we'll talk more about Lou Eskapool later. But this is looking down the San Pedro. You can see where it's going towards the Charleston Hills. Now move it a little more, and there's the Charleston Hills now coming into view. And in the lower right foreground, you can see some bedrock. That darker gray area there is actually an outcrop of silicified limestone that turned out to be a lithic source that was used quite a bit in the San Pedro Valley. But the Clovis people at Murray Springs apparently did not know about this at that time, because we have no artifacts at Murray Springs or flakes that are made from that material. Whereas the Lehner site, which is 10 miles upstream, they do have 8 artifacts that are made from that silicified limestone. So it was one of the lithic quarry areas that was used from then on up in the San Pedro Valley.
It's curious that it's really ubiquitous in the archaic assemblages from the San Pedro. Everybody used it. And it shows up at the Lehner site, and it's really obvious, right? It's right up against the river, and the material is just as plain as day. So it's always struck me as odd that the Clovis people at Murray Springs didn't use this more than they did. On the other hand, they did find stuff at the St. David outcrop, where there's the St. David, what you call the St. David chalcedony, which is very hard to find. But they found that one, so it's always struck me as a little peculiar that the way they find the rare stuff and they miss the obvious stuff.
Yeah, one of the things about this Lewis Hill locality is that a lot of the quarry pits from the archaic and later are very, very well preserved. And so it would be interesting to do more archaeological work on that hill to see if we could actually find a Clovis quarry. That would be pretty cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're panning back down the Curry Draw, and now you can see that there's a straight line there. That is actually a railroad bed. That there was a railroad spur that goes from the main track along the San Pedro. That's the bridge, and that spur goes to Fort Huachuca, supplies Fort Huachuca. This is taking a look at down on the San Pedro River itself. That's Lou Eskapool, I think that is Stanford. Looking at the San Pedro River, we're essentially upstream from the Charleston Hills in this view.
Is work going on at the Murray Springs site already at this point?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's one of the cottonwood groves. Now this you might say is the discovery shot of Curry Draw. This is when Pete Merringer and I, that's Pete Merringer there, walking up to the head cut. And you can see in the background in that head cut a little black streak going across the face of that vertical wall there. That is the black mat. And we had been working at the Laner site and became familiar with the black mat there because it covers the Clovis occupation surface. So when we decided to explore the headwaters of Curry Draw, back in those days we called it Murray Springs Arroyo. We didn't know it was called Curry Draw. And we had been working downstream on one of Paul Martin's pollen locations. And so this day we decided to go up and look at the head cut, which we'd never been to before. We saw that black band, and I made some comment to Pete that, boy, if we could just find some mammoth bones under that black layer, we'd probably have a geographic grant in the bag. And no sooner after having said that, right up there to the left around the corner, in that tributary, we found mammoth bones coming out underneath the black mat. That's the black mat that we could see at the head cut. But just off to my left here, the next shot will show this discovery area. This is a tributary. It's a tributary is what we call the East Swale, because you can see the Huachucas in the background. And so what I'm looking at here is these mammoth bones coming out below this black layer. So that was pretty exciting. We're picking at the mammoth bones here. But anyhow, it's after this that we went around to the, now, don't go any farther here. It's after that we went around to the north head cut. And in the north head cut, Pete found another deposit of bones coming out, and that's where we ought to show that picture of Pete coming out of locality 2.
Right. We
can insert that right here.
Okay.
Because at that point, this appears to be a spring. Because after we excavated it, well, even before we excavated it, you could see right there in the outcrop the axis vertebra of a camel. There was mammoth teeth, there was some tusk fragments, there was some bison bones, all in this one exposure. So now this is all on the same day.
Well, how long did you guys, once you found it, I mean, I can imagine I probably would have spent the rest of the day there.
Well, we just, hopped in our vehicle and headed back for Tucson, airborne. I mean, because we went to Howry, to Ray Thompson. We went to Ted Smiley, to John Lance and Paul Martin, and so we got all these people out there to look at this site, and so it was a very exciting situation.
All right.
And my comment about the geographic was right on, because at that point I called Mel Payne, who was headed up their research committee in those days, and told him that we had found this site, that we had found it in spring, and with this mammoth deposits under the black mat, like Laner, is a very good likely possibility. It's a Clovis site. And I told him that's, it's before the summer rains. We would like to see if we could test this site before the summer rains, which could wind up washing all this stuff away. And so they gave us an emergency grant. right off the bat. Essentially $4,000.
So the next sequence we're going to start looking at is going to show some early excavations, right?
Yeah, this is so. Now keep in mind at that time, these are mostly graduate students. They're volunteers, and they're not getting paid. What they're getting their subsistence taken care of, but they're not any wages or anything. So this is the opening up of what we call Locality 3. And the first year, 1966, we excavated Locality 1, which is right there on the left side of this picture. It conjoins with Area 3, so it's essentially one big area. So you're seeing the clearing off of Area 3 after we had already used Jim Smith and his backhoe to come down to remove some of the overburden, essentially. This is a view of Area 3 from just the opposite bank downstream a little bit. The Huachuca's in the background. And that prominent mesquite tree you see there with not much greenery on it is, that's our best shade tree for our lunches.
that tree's still there. It has more shade now.
It's still there, yeah.
Well, I point out you guys started pretty big. I mean, at this point, you didn't have any evidence that there was archaeology associated with this fauna.
That's not true. The previous 1966 season, on that mammoth, the Discovery Mammoth, we actually found the remains of, remains of a single mammoth, parts of which had been eroded away, of course. But with those bones, we found 3 pieces of Marreconite, of obsidian nodules. We found 4 other tools, none diagnostic. So my argument to Geographic was that, and we found a flake coming out in that head cut, in that tributary head cut. We found a flake on the north side of it, or on the west side of it, that was a bifacial thinning flake. And so I told him that, that there's obviously more archaeology to the west, and next season we'd like to open up the west side of that tributary to see if we can, demonstrate that it's a Clovis site. And that worked out beautifully, because that's when we found this single mammoth that we initially had called that, the crew had, on one weekend they'd seen some movie, and I don't know, it had Earl Flynn in it or something, so they called that mammoth Big Earl. And it was Jeff Saunders was also one of our graduate students who was a paleontology student of Ev Lindsay and John Lance. And after Jeff had studied the mammoth, he said, you better call it Big Eloise. He said, this is a female, so Big Earl became Big Eloise. You can see that off to the right there, that little streak of black mat, that was our Discovery black mat. So this is uncovering Big Earl, and we just panned by the skeleton. So this is looking at the ground around that elephant, taking off the black mat. See, the procedure was we would, with mechanical equipment, we would come down to the top of what we call the Donné silt, which is a gray silt that overlies the black mat. And then with tools, we would then go down through that to the black mat. And so what you're seeing on those little remnants of the corner stakes is the Donné silt. And it's right under the black mat where we start finding the bones and the artifacts. So the black mat is essentially covering the Clovis occupational surface as if it was a blanket somebody had laid down on it. So this is now in the black mat, we do that with dental tools and bamboo splints and stuff like that. So Barney Burns, he's one of our foremen, and that's Virginia Corsarco there. The other lady there is I've forgotten her name. Oh, Beth Walton. So that's Tom Hemmings there with his shoe in the picture now, and this Don Grable with the little balding spot. This is a picture of them excavating Big Earl. And you can see...
Was it Big Earl while they're at this moment, or was it Big Eloise at this moment, when they're uncovering it right now?
What was that?
Did they know the sex of the mammoth yet in this scene?
Yes. Yep.
And there's Jeff Saunders.
Jeff Saunders, and the young lady there is Suzanne Rothstein. This is looking down the draw, the direction from which we came up. That's Morris Eckhart there. He's a high school student from Bisbee. Another pan down the draw. Morris Eckhart. Bill Barrera doing the fast brushing there. And that's Judy Green coming up with the headscarf on. So you can see these corner stakes. We're leaving those in place for a while we get the mapping done. And you can see when you, as you go through the black mat, you get into lighter colored ground below it. So that's the stratigraphic context of this stuff is just, it just couldn't be any better. It's an archaeologist's dream when it comes to excavation.
Well, I see an undulating surface. At this point, were you guys talking about mammoth tracks yet? At this stage?
Yeah, this is where at this point, you know, Tom and I were both wondering what these little depressions and things were, and I was, you know, telling him, you know, well, there's a geological process, you know, called boudinage, where you get between a resistant and a non-resistant bed, you get this sausage-like depressions formed, and we were both, I think, thinking these are mammoth tracks, but we were afraid to say it. And at that point, Howery comes down and he overlooks the site and he says, "What are all those depressions down there?" And I said, "Well, you know," I started to give this equivocation, and he says, "Well, they're mammoth tracks," you know. So anyhow, it's pretty obvious that's what they are.
Just tell me when to stop.
Yeah, that's Barney Burns with the feather in his hat.
Yeah, I like his coat.
And you can see we're putting our back dirt into the main arroyo now. That's where the screens are set up.
Uh-huh.
Now, at that point, we were using, now this is the, hold on here, this is, I'm trying to figure out where we are here. Okay, if this is, if that's the ramp we used to come down into locality 1, that would be locality 1 where the guy is standing.
Right.
And this would be the edge of the tributary head cut right there in the lower right foreground.
Yeah.
So the middle of the picture here is the divide between locality 1 and locality 3.
Right.
Okay. I think that's it. So now we're panning into area 3. Yeah, that's correct, because that's they're uncovering Eloise there. So this is the unexcavated part there that you just saw.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's the ramp coming down into locality 1.
Mm-hmm.
That's the filled head cut, and now we're panning across area 3. So this is when we still have left the grid corners intact with a little bulk of sediment around each grid corner. So you can see how the screens are set up and where the material is going down into Curry Draw.
Right.
Now, Tom is walking across the Mammoth tracks.
Now he's looking suspicious.
This is about the time that we're beginning to realize we've got Mammoth tracks here. So that deep spot you see there in the lower right foreground is not too far from where the bone tool. The bone tool was probably found just off the picture here, just below that deep footprint there. This is one of the more interesting geological features of the Murray Springs Clovis Site, is that the black mat splits. And when you look at it in cross-section, you see this split where you have basal black mat lying on the Clovis surface, and then above it you have what we call the Earp marl with stringers of black mat in it, and then at the top there's another black mat that covers it. So, and of course the black mat, the carbon-14 dates in the black mat and in these subdivisions within this show that this is a Younger Dryas deposit. So one of the exciting aspects of it is here we have a microstratigraphic sequence through the Younger Dryas, which you could never get dealing with just the black mat by itself, because it's first of all, it's compressed and it's bioturbated. So here it's spread out. But this actually leads to a better exposure off to the left here. So this is a cross section. Now, let's hold it here for a minute. This is a cross-section of the ramp that comes down through locality 1. So I'm standing on the edge of locality 3, looking into locality 1, which are, they're all one locality. And so what you're seeing here is where the black mat splits, and it is separated by this very pulverant marl that we call the Earp marl. Now the black mat, I named the Clanton clay because it's black, and the Clantons were the Black Hats in Tombstone. But the white marl separating the black mat is I named after the Earps, which are supposed to be the White Hats, even though the Earps weren't all that all that saintly to begin with. So what you're seeing here then is a surface that the mammoths had dug. It's what's there is their water hole. And so a lot of those little depressions are the mammoth tracks, but that very deep one is the deepest part of their water hole. So you can see from here, right after Clovis time, you get this 1 centimeter or 2 centimeter thick layer of black mat laid down. And then the site becomes a pond, so you can see these layers of the pond-laid Earp marl separated by stringers of black mat, and then terminated by a black mat at the very top. So the black mat represents just a damp period, whereas the marl represents standing water, essentially. And then it terminated by another black mat where there's less water. So you're looking at a microstratigraphy of the Younger Dryas, essentially in that picture, because the dates at the base of the black mat, the oldest date we were able to get on that's about 10,600 radiocarbon years ago, and the date at the top is around 9,700. So it's essentially Younger Dryas.
Did you date this small section right here? Was this ever dated, this small section?
This section here, see, this is before the accelerator mass spectrometer. So we had to date, to get organic matter out of that stuff, we had to use large samples. So I didn't do any dating other than the black mat itself until later. Mm-hmm. So later we have done microstratigraphic dating in that stuff. Now this was the big find of 1967. It's the bone shaft wrench. And so what you're seeing here is Barney Burns, one of the discoverers, pointing to the portion that was in contact with the black mat.
I think Jeff Saunders told me that was his finger.
What was that?
Jeff Saunders told me that was his finger once.
That may be Jeff Saunders. You're right. That is probably Jeff Saunders pointing it out with Barney Burns taking the photograph.
Right. That sounds good.
So what he's pointing at is the portion of the shaft ridge that was in contact with a black mat, hence the black staining. And the lower part of it, beyond the break there, is where it was pressed down into the subiprary mud. And keep in mind, the subiprary mud, you know, is 30,000 years old. So it looks like this thing was stepped on by a mammoth and broken and pushed down into that mud. This is Barney Burns putting preservative on one of the mammoths. We tried to preserve one of the mammoth tracks, so we took turns putting preservative on that thing. It didn't work out. We weren't able to it came apart when we tried to take it out. So this is a pan over Eloise. The thing about Eloise was that it was pretty much intact. Now maybe we ought to stop on that one of these scenes of Eloise. I don't know which one, but we ought to stop and talk about the conditions of the skeleton.
Okay. How about this one?
Okay, this is a little washed out, but it'll do. So it turns out Eloise was essentially intact. She was missing, I believe, her left leg, hind leg, most of the bones of the left hind leg, and the other hind leg was up, had been moved up near the skull. So it was pretty much intact. Whereas the mammoth remains that we found in the first season in 1966 were kind of scattered all over the place. But an interesting thing about that 66 season is that there was a mandible that was resting, there was a scapula that was put on top of a mandible and a vertebra set on top of the scapula.
Oh, yeah.
So there was a stacking of bones there. Now, one of the things we always wondered about locality one was that mammoth actually killed by Clovis people, or was it scavenged? And I think it was probably scavenged. It's probably a little bit earlier than this because some of those mammoth tracks went right through where those bones were. We didn't recognize them at that point in time. That's Jim Smith and his backhoe. He became very talented at getting the overburden off and stopping right in the top of the Donne silt. He ran a plumbing business and an excavation business in Sierra Vista. So this is actually looking over Area 3 at a fairly early time in excavation. The lunch tree is over there on the right, just at the top. Now you can see the ramp coming down into Area 1 in that picture. Now we ought to stop here and point out that what we're looking at now, boy, that's out of focus. What we're looking at now is the creek bed with which the Clovis people and the animals interacted. So at Clovis time, this was a stream channel that had pretty much stopped being a flowing stream because the mammoth tracks went right across the sand bed of that and were not wiped out by subsequent discharge. But we named it Wolf Creek because we had actually found some bones of dire wolf in Area 3. And Hurley had named the Clovis Age Creek at the Laner site the Mammoth Creek. So we decided to name this one Wolf Creek after the wolf remains. So Wolf Creek goes, stay there a while.
Okay.
Wolf Creek goes through, across the arroyo and into the north wall, and then it comes out in the north head cut at what we call Area 2. And so what you're seeing, the back dirt pile you see there is the back dirt from our excavations in Area 2.
And
So
those deposits are still there.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We never found any artifacts associated with the fauna. There's no Clovis artifacts at Area 2. And I suspect that it was probably an area of quicksand because it's essentially a spring conduit. And I think that any animal of any weight could essentially get trapped into that thing. And that's probably why there were so many bones there. They were getting stuck in that spring conduit. So what I'm doing now is panning across the north wall of Curry Draw so you can see various places. We stop here. So yeah, we should stop just a little bit before this to show where we're actually put this backhoe trench in for Pete Maringer so he could take pollen samples through the coral marl. So what you're looking at here is probably the thickest section of coral marl in Curry Draw. And the coral marl rests on top of the subiprine mud. So that's that greenish gray area you see at the bottom of the white marl. But there's also a dark zone there, and almost as dark as the black mat in places, but it's in the subiprine mud. And that gives a radiocarbon date, the subiprine mud radiocarbon dates in the 30,000 year range. Whereas dates we got, this is where I sampled the coral marl for radiocarbon dating, and where Pete Maringer sampled it in 10 centimeter intervals for his pollen work. And unfortunately, it didn't bear, the pollen was not reproducible in a countable quantity. So, but the carbon-14 dating worked out fairly well. I dated both the carbonate fraction and the organic fraction of the carbonate. And the way I dated the organic fraction of the carbonate was by pyrolyzing the carbonate. You put it in a furnace in a closed atmosphere and heat it up to 600 Fahrenheit, centigrade, and let it cool down, and it turns dark gray. What's happening is I'm carbonizing the organic matter in there. So when you hydrolyze that calcium carbonate, you can date the carbon dioxide that comes off with the carbonate, and then you can date the black precipitate. It's a nice, easily treatable carbon precipitate, and get another date. So my dates through there start out around 27,000. But when you get up to the top of it, they're contaminated by pedogenic carbon brought down from the soil processes from the surface. So whereas the top of the coral marl probably dates no less than about 15,000 years ago, at this section here we got dates that are like 10,000 because of this contamination. But you can also see on top of that is this nice soil that where the coral marl is covered by younger sediments, including the G units, which have this very well developed soil on them, and that's the soil you see there, the black layer. Panning down, you can see there's been some flow in Curry Draw, a little dark street where the water goes. Oh. Now we're back at locality 3. This is a very nice flake knife. It's a backed knife, backed by snapping, flake knife that's in with Eloise. It's right in the within the skeleton area.
So what was the protocol when they found, you seem to have gotten everything on film, so did they stop and go find you, or?
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to have happen here is that any time that they found an artifact, to wherever I was, get me there so I could, film it with the camera, but I also wanted to see what the microstratigraphic position of that artifact was with respect to the black mat. And as I think I pointed out, that well over 90% of them are essentially occurring on the surface covered by the black mat. So each time we would find an artifact, we would try to get the microstratigraphic position of it. And then I would also try to photograph it as it was being removed.
Yeah.
So we'll see some of those photographs coming up. Now, these are the...
This next slide we're going to see is I think you told me it was the take. It was the take for the 1967 season.
It was the what?
It was the take. It was everything you got.
Yeah.
And so I think you have almost all of these things being uncovered at one point or another on this film.
Yeah, this is the take from the Area 3 of the 67 season. So as you can see, there's some huge bifacial thinning flakes, and then there's that blade that we found 2 parts of it, never found the third. And then there's the 3 projectile points, the little white tip, and then there's that white chalcedony one, which is some of the St. David chalcedony. That was actually the first artifact we found, and we'll see that coming out. And then down below it is the petrified wood tip of a Clovis point that had been reworked, reversing the direction of the point. So what was originally the base became the tip, and it has that flute.
Yeah, the flute's going the wrong way.
The flute going the wrong way.
Uh-huh.
And the biface on the right side there, is the biface that has a very well-worn edge. It's more than just grinding, edge grinding. It's actually polished around that edge, like it had been used to rub on a hide or something. And the flake that conjoins with it is one of these bifacial thinning flakes. That's actually an overshot flake.
Uh-huh.
And that's the flake that was sticking out of the wall on the west side of the tributary head cut that led us, to believe that we had more artifacts going on the west side of the head cut. Plus the fact that it's a Clovis bifacial thinning flake with that overshot thing. That's taking out another flake. That was in that picture. Yeah, one of the things I was using, experimenting with, was using compressed air. So we were using compressed nitrogen in the carbon lab, so I brought one of the cylinders of compressed nitrogen out and tried that, and it worked pretty well. You always kind of worried whether if you hit a small flake, it might blow it out of beyond where you could find it. These are some of the obsidian artifacts from the site. The 3 chunks are essentially nodules from Area 1, the first year, the 1966 season. And the Clovis point is from the Bison Kill area, which pretty much we excavated in the 1968 season. But Steve Shackley pinned down the source for this as being the Cow Canyon area over in the White Mountains. It was a locality that had been unknown to him for a long time, and he spent one summer really trying to find that locality, and by God, he found it.
Well, they're amazingly small.
Yeah, I don't think there's any pieces of that are bigger than 10 centimeters,
Yeah.
if that.
I think most archaeologists these days, if they were to find those artifacts somewhere on a site, they'd assume it was ceramic period, right?
It was what?
They would assume that it was a ceramic period site.
Yeah, right. That's right. Because, Cow Canyon became a pretty prominent lithic source later.
Yeah.
This is just uncovering another artifact, again, right at the contact between the black mat and the subiporine mud. Now, this was a very interesting find. This is a pile of bifacial thinning flakes where the flakes are in contact with each other. So Morris Eckhart is excavating this. He was our high school graduate that was one of our volunteer crew members. And this is amazing when you think that that has been a intact pile of thinning flakes for 13,000 years. It's pretty impressive. This is, I'm adding more preservative to that mammoth track we were trying to preserve. And you can see Pete Lauderman in the background here, chipping away. One of our policies was that after we had excavated the Clovis surface, we then went below the Clovis surface to see what archaeology might be below it. I'm not sure where this scene is. You know, this may not be Murray Springs.
Well, it can't be too many other places because it looks like he's got an artifact. It looks like a blade.
It looks like a blade, it does indeed. Oh, no, this can't be the surface site. That's Jeff Saunders working on Eloise. That little white spot where we chipped the tooth of Eloise with the backhoe, that was the day we had a backhoe operator other than Jim King. He sent a substitute out, and he was not as talented as Jim was, and he hit the top of that mammoth tooth. This is using the compressed nitrogen to clean the dust off of Eloise.
I see some bones that are really dark and some bones that are more white. Is that because of the preservative or
yeah, that's because of the epoxy preservative. Any place that the black mat was in contact with bone, it was already dark. But when we put the epoxy on it, it made it even darker. And then we discovered that the epoxy was light sensitive. The sunlight would actually make it darker.
Who was running your camera when you're on film here?
I don't know who was. It must have been Tom Hemmings.
Yeah.
See, where my left foot is there is where that knife came, that little flat spot in there, that's where that knife came from. This is Judy Green showing some of the artifacts from Area 3. And that's the biface with the very dull polished edge.
Yeah.
That's the flake knife. And you see the knife was back by simply snapping it. And this is that blade that we never found the other part of.
Right.
And the background to this shot is some of the crumbles of the black mat that have gone through the screen.
I was wondering about that
Yeah.
surface. It looks.
And see, at this point, we had not recognized that bifacial thinning flake that we had discovered coming the head cut conjoined with that piece of the biface. We did
Looks like
discover
it's got a lab number on it already.
What is that?
It looks like it has a lab number on it already.
Yeah. Yeah, that's Judy Green in the striped shirt and Virginia Casarco with the head thing, and that's Pete Lauderman now making one of the artifact discoveries. Pete found all the Clovis points, much to everybody else's chagrin. So this is the find. This is the second artifact we actually found in '67. It's the tip of a Clovis point made on petrified wood, and it really doesn't need water to show it up. As you can see, the water hit it more than show it up. But this is when we had a National Geographic photographer there, Sam Abel, and so that was Sam Abel, you see, photographing this thing. And it's no doubt that it's petrified wood from the petrified forest. It just beautifully matches some of the polished sections of petrified wood that you see. So that's Sam Abel taking these photographs. And the Geographic never used these photographs. I think one of the reasons why Murray Springs didn't make it into the Geographic that year was because there was some space launching that pretty much took over the magazine for that issue. But I was never able to get to look at what the photographs that Sam was taking because I just never got to see him, and years later I wrote to him to see if we could have a look at those, and got no response. So this is the petrified wood piece that is where the channel flake ripples go in the reverse direction. So it's a very nice find. It's the only petrified wood we found in the artifact assemblage anywhere in the San Pedro Valley. So it's a piece that I think was so treasured that they tried to make it last as long as they possibly could. This is probably going to be another artifact uncovering. That's Pete Laudeman again, about to find another Clovis point. And in the background, you can see the ramp coming into locality 1. This is all of the blades, 3 of the blades that we found. The tool on the left there is a very interesting tool. It's a knife with a, it's a uniface with a knife edge, and on the lower point there is a burin blow, a very distinctive burin blow to a notch that they had put into the side of it for that burin to pop out of. That is typical of the Upper Paleolithic. Some of the burins made in the Upper Paleolithic. And on the reverse side, they actually took some flakes to remove the bulbar percussion. So it's a very interesting tool.
I don't recall seeing any blade cores from the site, though.
We never found a blade core. Unfortunately, we never found a blade core.
Vance, this is a really important part of the story.
You know, this situation here may be as important, if not more so, than the bone tool. What we have here are 2 Clovis points with 2 impact fractures. And the one on the left is one that Bruce Bradley actually found when he was walking into the site. He was walking across Area 6, and what we now call Area 6, and found this thing on the surface. There had been enough disturbance to the surface that this thing showed up. And when we started comparing it to some of our flakes, it turns out, I guess it was Tom Hemmings that found this flake, that impact flake that matched that point. And that flake is from the Bison Kill area. It's about 80 meters away. But the other one on the right is the Clovis point found in the Bison Kill with an impact fracture that was found in the Area 7 camp area, 150 meters away from where the point came from. So it's in the area of the camp that, and of course, we think that the camp was where the meat was probably being dried, probably women drying the meat. So I kind of humorously speculated that this is a woman, she's filleting the strips to put on the drying rack and finds this flake and says, oh, that's my husband's material. That's his point that killed this bison. Anyway. But you can also see, if you look closely, that the corner of that point is broken off. And if I remember correctly, it was only a meter away. They were separated by about a meter in the site.
Well, these artifacts, they tie the bison kill and the mammoth kill both to the campsite area.
You couldn't better, bracket the tie the two together than by finding these impact flakes. The only thing in the camp area that we could tie to the bison kill was there was a mammoth long bone on the surface in that camp area. At first, it looked like caliche. It was exposed on the surface, and it just looked like more of the normal caliche. Until we got to looking at it a little closer and got to brushing on it, and no, it was a long bone, a mammoth. The articular ends were gone. Mm-hmm. But that could be that one of the missing long bones of Eloise's leg, of the missing leg.
Yeah. And how long did it take to achieve these refits, to put them back together?
The refits that on Bradley's find, as I say, Tom Hemmings, I think, pretty much found that at the site at the time. But the one on the right was 2 years later, I think it was, when Bruce Huckle, in his research, was actually looking through the thousands of, I mean literally thousands of flakes that we have from the site, when he found that this thing was a match. And of course we could hear the shout from across the campus when he actually found this match.
Well,
it was a great find.
Yeah, they are great finds.
Now this is Pete Latimer again finding this. I believe is the first Clovis point we found at the site that 67 season.
At this point, he knows he's got a point. Is this all for show? Does he know he has a point there?
I don't know. There's something there.
There it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I see that this is where it's in place. It hasn't been removed, and we're filming it. So this is actually the first Clovis point we find. This is the first, aside from that big bifacial thinning flake.
Yeah.
This is the first positive evidence we had a Clovis site. It's a strange point because it's made of the chalcedony from St. David, but it looks unfinished. It has no edge grinding.
Yeah.
It's fairly crude, and you can see on the tip there that there's some cortex.
Yeah.
And a knot.
So this is, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is the first point you find at Murray Springs.
Yeah.
Before you found this point, were you certain that you were looking at Clovis?
I just couldn't imagine anything else. I mean, considering what had been found at the Lehner and Naco sites, plus the fact we had found that bifacial thinning flake.
Yeah.
And even as an amateur, when I was out hunting blowouts, we got to realize that the Paleo-Indian flakes, particularly very early Paleo-Indian flakes, are fairly recognizable. Because of they're very thin. Some of them are paper thin. Yeah, that's a little bit of the cortex right on the tip. So it's really not as functional a Clovis point as it could be. It makes you wonder if this isn't, somebody who's learning how to flint knack.
I suppose they had kids.
Like what?
I suppose they had children.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have often wondered if that wasn't the explanation for these miniature Clovis points we find at sites. Blackwater Draw had 2. This is area 2, where we didn't find any cultural material, but it's where we had a lot of charcoal. And so this is Dennis Stanford collecting some of the charcoal. Now keep in mind, that's back in the days where there was no accelerator. So, to get a proper date on charcoal, you had to have about a teaspoonful of it. So we're collecting this. We're also collecting it for wood ID. And it turns out that most of the wood ID at Murray Springs is fraxinus, it's ash.
Yeah.
So this is a shot, hold it here now. This is a shot from locality 3, seeing where the Clovis Age channel, Wolf Creek, goes through the west wall of the south head cut. So what I'm doing here is panning along that to show that not only the channel, but to show the basal black mat, how it rises up over a truncated coral marl. So if you can continue the pan now, you can see that thing going up at an angle. That's the Clovis Age surface, and it's truncating the coral marl.
So they didn't have an arroyo; they had a swale.
Yeah, yeah. It's a sloping bank channel.
Mm-hmm.
So where I was picking there is actually the coral marl, but what's just above the black mat is actually the earth marl.
So if they had a swale, how do you explain them trapping or manipulating the bison into a kill situation?
Yeah, there was no head cut to trap those animals. So Tom Hemmings in his dissertation suggested that they may have made a brush corral or sort of a brush-shaped, a U-shaped, horseshoe-shaped trap where they got them into this thing and were able to get enough projectile points into some of them that, well, there were actually 11 in Area 4. If we include the bison in Area 3, that's 12 bison.
Yeah.
So this is a close-up now of the channel of Wolf Creek, and what I'm about to do is to outline the base of the channel. So there's actually two talwigs here. That's the low part of the channel, and now I'm going over a little hump and down into another lower part of the channel. So that's the deepest part right there, and then it goes back up. So that's one of the beauties of this site, is that the base of the black mat defines the Clovis age surface, no matter where you are. Now stop here a minute. There's a scene that we'll see where Ballenger and I are sampling, I think, subiprine mud, and it's in that little backhoe cut you see there on the left. The cut you see on the right is the really deep cut where we did the sampling for the pollen and the sampling for the radiocarbon dating that I think I talked about earlier. You can see how there's partings in the coral marl. Those are clay partings. And so there's the same, it's the same sort of olive green clay as the subiprine mud. Mm-hmm. So what we're looking at then is fluctuations in the pond, the level of that pond. Times when there's a little thin layer of clay being deposited. And one of the things we notice is on those clay layers, there would be a coating of shells, of snail shells.
Mm-hmm. There's also a conspicuous absence of bioturbation.
There's no bioturbation in this stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, when you get to the top, that's a whole different ballgame because it's heavily pedoturbated in addition to bioturbated. This is a view of looking down Government Draw, which is on the other side of the San Pedro River. We're looking downstream towards the San Pedro River. Those cottonwoods in the background are in the San Pedro River. So I'm washing myself as Clovis people may have washed themselves in Wolf. This is sort of the analog, we think, of maybe Wolf Creek at the time when it was flowing. Now this is Jim Smith going up to check out some Chinaberry trees in East Swale. My thinking was that if these trees are growing here, these like cottonwoods, they have to have their roots in water or in moist ground. So I thought, well, maybe we have a springhead here. So we put some trenches at the upper end and on both sides and on the downstream side of these and found absolutely nothing. So we're looking now back towards the site. So I'm up above those things in the East Swale looking down to the site where you can see the dust from Jim's backhoe. Now we're at another black mat locality that is way downstream. This is down near the town of Benson. And so this is Pete Maringer chipping at, there's two localities here. We call them the Gray Ceph localities. One was found by Bob Gray, who defined the St. David Formation, and the other was found by Phil Ceph, both students of the geosciences. That's Jeff Saunders now picking at one of these. Now, we should have paused there long enough to say that that this Phil Seff, when he was doing his work in the San Pedro Valley, he's the one who first found that locality. And it had a scattering of lithics associated with mammoth bone fragments with a black mat layer there. I don't think he ever found anything directly under the black mat, but it was pretty obvious to him that this stuff had come out from that locality. So he wrote that up as a little paper for the Arizona State Museum, which is there. And it's later that Bob Gray, when he was doing his research on the St. David Formation, found that same locality. There's two places there where there's black mats exposed.
Yeah, well, it's a neat spot because it's so far north relative to other prominent black mats in the valley, and it really climbs up away from the river. It's at a much higher elevation.
Yeah.
Don't you know? So.
Yeah.
That's a line that goes from Gray Seff all the way to Laner, at which point you're almost down in the river valley.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, there was even, if you go farther downriver to Larry Agenbrod's, what's the name of that site that we excavated down there? It's where the coral marl is way up above the bed of the San Pedro River.
Cerro Blanco?
Is it the Cerro Blanco location?
Yeah. I think.
I forgot what we called it now. But there was a hint of black mat there.
Yeah. Okay, so here we're back in the...
Yeah, I guess what I'm doing here is just pointing out how we like to search arroyos because arroyos have nice exposures of the pages in the Book of Time. So I'm poking around at something here. And then one of the things that'll show up here is where I'm actually, when I had my International Harvester Scout, one of them, I would drive these things. You can see the tracks there. This is Lou Eskapool, and I think Dennis Stanford looking at, this could be Mosin Wash. I'm not sure. But at any rate, this is driving in the stream bed of going up, essentially, Woodcutter Draw. The Shaldack site is on the north side of Woodcutter Draw. And that, I went over a boulder here somewhere along the line. I think this may be it.
That was it. I think we just saw that boulder.
Oh, okay.
Your camera cut out.
And it interrupted my filming. So obviously there's too much sunlight in this thing. But at any rate, one of the ways to get to the Shaldack in that time was to drive up Woodcutter Draw and then cut through off the side and then bushwhack through. And that's, I think, what I'm doing here. We just go right through it.
Yeah.
And bushwhack our way over to the site.
They don't let us do that anymore.
Huh?
They don't let us do that anymore.
No. These are some other scenes. These are all in Woodcutter Draw. Now, there, as we'll see here sooner or later, there are times when you shouldn't be driving in these arroyos during the summer monsoon. Because one of the things that I was trying to do this summer was, when we had these summer storms, I was trying to pick out which storm would be going down, the discharge would be going down which arroyo, and so I'd keep my eyes on the Huachucas. And there was one time when I thought that the discharge was going to be coming down Woodcutter. I took my camera there, and then I thought, no, it's going to be coming down Curry Draw. So I got in the car and headed back to Curry Draw, when I noticed that, no, I was right in the first place. It's coming down Woodcutter Draw. So I went back and set up the camera on Woodcutter Draw, and as you'll see here in a minute, well, this is actually the development of a summer storm. So you're seeing low overcast, and thunderheads and things building up during the summer monsoon. Those are the Huachucas in the background. So I, at this time that I got back to woodcutter draw just in the nick of time, because I was able, as you'll see here, to pick up the very first edge of the discharge. This is the road, by the way, that we used to come into the site. Mosen Road didn't exist in those days, so we used to come in off of the highway.
Is this an afternoon thunderstorm?
I think so. So this is back at Woodcutter Draw now, showing the beginning of this discharge down Woodcutter Draw. And as you'll see, it just built up to the point where it filled the draw from bank to bank.
And you just pulled up here, right?
I had just barely gotten my camera set up. And this is this is now where it's reached its pretty much its maximum discharge. So it's about 6 or 8 feet deep here at this time. Now you can see standing waves starting to form. So you're reaching a peak discharge, and the standing waves get to a point where they actually build up and collapse. And when they collapse, they kind of move upstream. So this is one of the best examples of standing waves that I've seen. It's a class book example of it. I think when this, we'll have to give a copy of this to Vic Baker, who's very interested in the hydrology of these floods. Here you can see the standing waves building up. So now the bed load is actually moving upstream a little bit. So you're getting what's called anadunes. And now you reach a point where the waves, standing waves, are collapsing.
This must not have been very frequent during the Younger Dryas, otherwise you wouldn't have the black mat preserved as well as you do.
I don't think so. Yeah. This is down at the, I think it's about where Curry Draw comes into the San Pedro. Sort of the tail end of a flood period. And you can see the floodplain has a nice development of grass on it. The result of that storm was the head cut, the south head cut retreated about 10 meters, and so you can, I guess, I'm not sure exact amount, but you can see this narrow zone here is what was cut by that flood. And what it did was expose bones along the, below the black mat on the left side or on the left bank. And those bones turned out to be the bison bones that led us to the excavation of Area 4, which is the bison kill area. So Area 4 conjoined with Area 5 to make one big area that had 11 bison in it that had been interacted with by the Clovis people.
Yeah. I think that's the last of the footage from Murray Springs, but you were pretty busy that summer. This is a different site.
Yeah, this is going into the Shaldack site, bushwhacking after crossing Woodcutter Draw. And so we're going to the site at a time when they're starting to clear off the vegetation and getting ready to lay out a grid. That's Dennis Stanford's Doberman named Fritz running off in the distance. That's the National Geographic flag we have there. Now, one of the things that led us to the Shaldack site was that Lou Eskapool, he had early on found a little Clovis point at what we now call the Eskapool site. And so he's showing us now where he found some of these points. And it's in an area where there is a very heavy occupation of archaic pre-ceramic stuff. And so that Clovis point that he found could be a pickup. But he also found a beautiful black Dalton point, believe it or not, a Dalton point, probably made out of the silicified limestone from Lewis Hill.
Uh-huh.
So this is clearing the site before we actually lay out the grid. The arroyo in the background there is a tributary of Woodcutter Draw. So the procedure was to cut off all of the vegetation right at the ground surface. Panning over the Shaldack site. The name Shaldack comes from the landowner. I looked the ownership up in Bisbee, in the county seat, and it's a guy named Shaldack who lived in California. And it turns out he eventually sold this property to somebody out of Sierra Vista. I didn't know it was. I should have seen what he wanted for it, because I think we probably could have bought it for a song back in those days.
I think it's a dirt track now, right?
Yeah, it's a dirt track. So the grid's laid out. We're now excavating it. Now, keep in mind that much of the mammoth remains here were exposed at the surface. So it's another situation where it didn't look like you had much of a site, because it was right at the surface, and much of the black mat even had been eroded away. So it was a lot like the Eskapool site that we'll talk about a little later. So this is the tributary arroyo. It's where we're putting our back dirt as we screen it, with the Huachucas looking to the west in the background. Where this tributary comes into Woodcutter Draw and downstream a little bit, there are a nice grove of desert walnut trees, and off to the right and behind me, where I'm standing with the camera, is where Lou Eskapool had also found some more mammoth teeth coming out, and I think we'll see a shot of one of those somewhere along the line here. We never did much with that site. It's one that I think you found. You saw it later.
Sure. Well, you mentioned that there are a couple of juvenile mammoths there represented.
Yeah, the Shaldack site had two mammoths, one of which was the best preserved was a young mammoth, fairly young. I forgot now what age Jeff assigned to it. Jeff was using the criteria by a Brit named Laws, who had developed this from looking at the culling going on in Africa of the family unit. So he worked out an age chronology based upon the tooth morphology. So this is after a rain, so you can see that there is black mat there. And excavating Shaldack. That's the Charleston Hills in the background, and the distant background are the Tombstone Hills. So we're looking towards Tombstone. On an overcast day. Now we're going back to this area that Lou Eskapool found these interesting points. So he's showing us. That's Lou and Dennis Stanford, and he's showing us where he found either the Clovis Point or the Dalton Point. We showed us both localities that day, and I'm not sure which is which. This, by the way, is the other tooth remains that's near Shaldack that I mentioned. So we're kind of mixing things up here. And this is looking at one of the locations, the concentrations of rocks. So it's a, it's a Cochise concentration of rocks. One of the hearths dated 4,000 something or other, and one of the hearths that I dated was 2,500, I think. So it's a heavy archaic occupation there. Yeah. So as I say, those points could have been pickups, because there was nothing archaeological found at the Shaldack site. Even though it was a nice, tender young mammoth, it's kind of curious as to why that critter died.
So that looks like it must be about half your crew there.
What?
It must be about half of your crew.
Yeah. This is Lou Eskapool there, and Jackie, his wife Jackie, excavating that Shaldack Mammoth. We eventually lost that tooth because over one weekend somebody shot it. We normally didn't have to worry about visitors. These sites were so remote that we just left our tools and everything there.
So they just shot the tooth?
But somebody shot one of those teeth, yeah, with a high-powered rifle. It was pretty well messed it up.
They're about 13,000 years too late.
Yeah. As you can see from that tusk, and the bones aren't well preserved here. The teeth were the best preserved.
Mm-hmm.
The bones were in bad shape. This is not long after that rain, so the contrast is better. That's Jeff Saunders excavating there in a striped shirt.
So how many days did you spend at Shaldack?
What was that?
How many days did you guys spend at Shaldack?
I don't remember. This is a very interesting situation here. This is what we call the Eskapool site. And so what you're looking at here is Jackie Eskapool and her kids, and Lou's obviously taking the picture. And this is a site that Lou had told the university about while I was at SMU. I hadn't even come back to Arizona at that time. And so John Lance and Bill Washley, John Lance from Geosciences, VP, he's a bird paleontologist, and who had worked at the Lehner site, and Bill Washley of the Arizona State Museum came out and looked at these bones, and it was just a scattering of fragmented bone. And their conclusion was that there was really not much left here to worry about. But when I got there, when I came back from SMU and was employed again by Arizona, they took me out there and showed me this and said, "What do I think about it?" And I said, "Yeah, I think it just doesn't look like there's much hope for stuff left here." Now we didn't shovel test it; we should have. But Lou got tired of these pros telling him that his site was no good, so he and Jackie went out there on this weekend, and you can see they opened up this bone bed right under the black mat, and so here these are the long bones, and you'll see here. So you're looking at the rib cage, and the rib cage has two Clovis points in it. There's one up there on the upper right, and there's another one down here just underneath one of these I think spinal bones. Anyhow, this is one of the 2 points. Now this is the points after Lou got them out, and he's showing them to Jim Ayers. That's Jim Ayers' hands that are holding these points at the Arizona State Museum. So there are two fabulous Clovis points, both of which have the tips missing. The tips are broke off. They're snapped off. They aren't. It's not a. It didn't drive an impact fracture back. So we were, of course, hoping we could find the tips of those things in that work we did at the site. Now what Lou was doing is showing us where those 2 points came from the site. And he told us that somebody, after they had found this, had rifled that rib cage. So when we opened it up again, and Lou's showing where the 2 points are, you'll see that there is no rib cage. So this is the excavations of what we call the Eskapool site. We're looking back. If you could go over that horizon, you'd go to the Murray Springs site. So it's not too far away.
And you didn't find one tiny flake there, huh?
Nary a flake. So this is the bones that we found. And off to the right, there's a tributary arroyo that comes in, it's just real close. And there was a mammoth tooth in that, under the black mat in that, which might have been part of this animal. Because we found no skull parts, no tusk remains, no skull part, no teeth, other than that tooth over in the arroyo. And Lou said he had found no remains of tusks or tooth. So now he's put the points back to where that rib cage was and where these would have been in that rib cage.
And you suppose that this might have been a mammoth that escaped from an attack?
Oh yeah, that would be my hypothesis, was that this is one that got away, because it's, if you look at all the known Clovis sites, there's the only site that has more than 2 Clovis points with a carcass is the Naco site, and it has 8. So these people were recovering, their spear points. So these are 2 that didn't get recovered, and they're still functional points. I mean, all you have to do is sharpen that tip, and you're back in business again. So I think this thing might have gotten away.
It's too bad we don't have a better handle on these cherts.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Those are, we don't know the source of those 2. One of the most prominent cherts is what Bruce Huckle calls the pinkish gray chert. And we've never been able to locate that source. That is material that we ought to show to Phil Guy, because Phil knows so much about the chert and the plateau area.
Well, what about southern sources?
Southern sources, we don't know much about those.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, we took, on a weekend, we usually poke around various historical stuff, and this is going down to the ruins of the Mosen ranch house. Mosen was one of the most famous cattle ranchers in San Pedro Valley, and it's his daughter one of his daughters married Bill Green, who was the copper king that had owned the copper mines in Cananea, Mexico, and had tremendous grazing areas here in the San Pedro. So those are very nice ruins. They're pretty good shape. We also were fortunate in having the Combat Surveillance School, U.S. Army Combat Surveillance School, in Fort Huachuca. And so they got interested in the site and asked if I'd like to have some photographs, and I said, absolutely. So they used this, this is the Vietnam War period. This is the Mohawk. It's a photo reconnaissance plane. And they're very interesting because the film is a big strip, and they can adjust the velocity of the film to the velocity of the plane, and they can keep a constant elevation off of a land surface, even if it's sloping, by using radar altimeter.
Yeah.
So they made these fabulous photographs for us and put together mosaics, not only of Curry Draw, but of Woodcutter and several other draws.
Well, I noticed that you still use them in the field.
Yeah. Yeah, they brought these out to us all mounted. Very nice.
Yeah.
And they actually gave me the film. So the film I've turned over to the Arizona State Museum. But they also put a ringer in there. They put in an arroyo that I've never been able to find. It's not in the San Pedro Valley. And I think they did that just to kind of see how I'd react to it. As we're panning across the Charleston Hills now, looking out towards what is the artillery range of Fort Huachuca. And it's on that artillery range that Warrant Officer Stanley Hurley found a mammoth. So this is when we're getting ready to go excavate that mammoth. So this is the portion of the Charleston Hills that are on the west side of the San Pedro Valley. So we're panning out into the artillery range, and one of these. This is panning down to what we now call the Hurley Mammoth Site. The Hurley Mammoth Site is essentially at the top of the subiprine mudstone. So it's probably somewhere between 25 and 30,000 years old. So it's a pre-Clovis, potential pre-Clovis site. So we're excavating it archaeologically on the chance that it might have some artifacts associated with it. That's Dennis Stanford putting preservative on this Hurley mammoth's tusk. It was a big mammoth, as you can see. That's Beth Walton on the left there. Tom Hemmings mapping the bone bed.
So did you have a pretty good handle on the chronology at this point? You knew it was significantly older than Clovis.
It pretty well. We may not have had any actual dates on the subiprine mud at that time, but we would have within the next season.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's Morris Eckhart again in the white sweatshirt. Beth Walton in the checker shirt. Beth later became an archaeologist for the BLM in Wyoming.
Well, I think that's about the end of the summer. I put in a slide here, Vance. I thought we could go back to Murray Springs just briefly and kind of bring us up to date.
Oh, okay.
This is an aerial photograph that shows Murray Springs located in the red box. And you can see Curry Draw with its east and west swales. And at the very top of the draw, you can see the Sierra Vista water recharge facility. And this was designed to stop the cone of depression from migrating into the San Pedro and causing it to run dry. So can you talk a little bit about what's been going on there?
I think the people that ran the wastewater treatment plant, initially they had evaporative ponds. And see, back in those days, initially, that's Moson Road going just right there. Moson Road didn't exist back in those days. And they put these evaporative ponds in, but apparently that wasn't working properly, so they decided to go to infiltration ponds, where they would open up the floor of these ponds with the hope that the water would soak down to the aquifer. And I assume they were going for the deep aquifer. But what happens is it's hitting what we call an aquiclude. It's hitting a deposit that water doesn't penetrate very well, so it runs off. And so what it's been doing is raising a local perched water table. And the perched water table is intersecting Curry Draw right at the Murray Springs site.
Well, yeah, you can just look at the map here and see, kind of predict what's going to happen.
Yeah. So it's converting Murray Springs to a wetland, which is not good. The yellow boundaries, by the way, you tell me that's the boundaries of the BLM's riparian preserve.
That's right.
This whole part of this upper San Pedro, very fortunately, is being preserved as a riparian.
Yeah.
One of the last riparian rivers in the United States.
Yeah. So this is just a graph that shows the last 10 years of flow from Curry Draw. And you can see, starting around 2006, we start to get a spike during the winter, a higher spike during the winter. And it really peaks out around 2009. So you can see there's just a really pronounced increase in flow as that water daylights there at Murray Springs.
The first clue we had was in late 2005. You could see damp ground in what we call Trench 22 in Murray Springs, which is part of the channel.
All right. Well, here's a shot of Trench 22. And it's got a cottonwood growing in it now.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah.
That should be an absolute bare royal bed with no vegetation on the floor or even on the sides.
Here's a shot of you and some other researchers in the head cut of the South Swale,
Yeah.
not far from locality 4.
Well, we're actually looking down on what would have been
5, yeah.
Area 4-5
Yeah.
conjunction. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can see them. You can see the black mat, but also the cattails are really thick in there. And behind, and just to the right of this frame, if you were to walk out there, you'd be above your ankles in water. It's a marsh.
Yeah.
And I even got a tick there. The first tick I ever got in the San Pedro came from right in there. But there's Vance Holiday on the left, and then moving right, there's you. Then there's Jason Windingstad and Levi Windingstad, and then there's Andrew Cowler holding the bucket there in the bottom.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've forgotten, I think it might have been 2006 when I first went in there when this had happened. It blew me away because there were cattails and I could hear bullfrogs in there. And I thought, bullfrogs at Murray Springs, that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And there was another time I went in there when 2 ducks flew up out of there, a pair of ducks.
Yeah.
And there was actually standing water with duckweed on the water. So what's happening is that it's saturating the lower portions of the stream banks and causing bank collapse.
Yeah. Well, here's another pretty severe problem, and one that really has nothing to do with the recharge facility, but the mesquite has really taken over the land.
Yeah.
And you can see these taproots go straight through the Quaternary geology.
Yeah, the root damage is getting to be as bad as the wall collapse.
Yeah.
Because any future excavation is going to have to deal with these roots.
Yeah. Well, here's a shot of you, Vance, and that photograph you're holding. What year do you think that might be?
That might be 67.
And you're doing repeat photography. You've been doing that since 67,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, there's none of that vegetation in there. You know, it's a total change.
Yeah.
That would be a place where you could show that early picture of Maringer walking towards the head cut,
Yeah.
and then a picture now. You know.
And so here's what the conditions of the banks are. You can see large cracks forming.
Yeah, this is just across from the little sunshade thing there.
Yeah. Well, the bison kill's right in front of us, behind that vegetation, right?
Yeah, Area 4 would be right over there to the
Yeah.
left.
And so these things are cracking as usual, especially as that toe, we understand, as that toe gets washed away, these things then, well, here you go,
Yeah,
collapse.
there's a big collapse.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, collapsing walls is a part of natural arroyal processes, but not with the frequency we're seeing now because of this high water table. This is a shot I took at the end of the '67 season, overlooking Area 3 and 1, when this rainbow developed. It really is. It was just one of those opportune moments, you know.
Yeah.
So we used this for the cover of the Murray Springs report. Art Jelinek actually enhanced it and then superimposed in the corner of it a mammoth skeleton, which happens to be one of the dent mammoths.
I didn't know Art had done that work.
Yeah, he did that.
Really?
Yeah.
Well.
And you can see that cylinder of nitrogen up there against our lunch tree.
Yeah.
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 And you notice the cars in the background?
Yeah.
See, that's before we realized we had a Clovis camp. So we were parking our cars there, and the disturbance our cars were making actually disturbed the ground enough that we started finding artifacts. The Clovis artifacts, you know.
I should park in more places.
Yeah.
Well, Vance, this has been, I've really enjoyed sitting down and watching this film with you, and I appreciate you allowing the Arc and His to make these
Well,
copies.
I'm just delighted that you guys, you and Alex, are being able to put all this together. It's taking a lot of time, but I think, you know, looking at it, I think it's going to be a great documentary to archive.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with that, thank you, Vance. And
Well, thanks for the opportunity to get this thing out. Yeah.
I look forward to going out in the field with you some more.
I had loaned these films to Marie Warmington when she was on her sabbatical studying at ASU. And so the people at ASU had put this big 16 millimeter roll together on one big spool. And that's why a lot of these things, I think, are mixed up, because they didn't know the chronology of the thing.
All right. Well, thank you, Vance.
Thanks.